Hi, my name is Maddie, and I'm a rising junior now at Bryn Mawr College. I'm actually really lucky. This summer I've had a fellowship, a research fellowship. It's for sort of pursuing an independent project, and it's a really amazing opportunity. My project is, and this was a huge, huge summary. What I'm about to give you, this explanation is not very complete at all, but my project is sort of about Navajo oral tradition. Um, and, I can't actually really look at the Navajo oral tradition itself, first of all, because I don't speak Navajo, and actually, second of all, because you can't look at oral tradition, which is a big part of my project, is actually thinking about translating oral traditions into texts, how ethical that is, what happens to an oral tradition when it becomes a text, if that's really the right way to look at an oral tradition ever. Look again, Um, and as a part of my research project, actually, I originally really wanted to make a video blog and have an ongoing video blog tracking my progress over the summer. And, it didn't happen. I ended up doing other things, and I've been reading a lot and I've been doing research, but it's hard and things got away from me and I didn't end up doing this part of the project really. But I did want to make a post, just kind of to see how it went. And because I think this is definitely a post that it's much easier to talk about than it is to write about. So I used the word translation when I was talking about what happens when a sort of an oral tradition becomes represented in text, becomes sort of a textual tradition. And I just want to talk a little bit about translation. In its most basic form, translation means, taking one word from a language and then the language that you're translating into, bringing, the equivalent word and just having them sort of like a big equal sign, like an equation, right? So, I have the word, the only language I know is Latin. I took Latin in high school. You have the word solve, for example, which we all learn on the first day. It means hello. So you take the word solve, you look at it, you see that it says hello, and you write down hello in English, and that's sort of the most basic way we think about translation happening. But there are lots of things that are very difficult to translate. You think about lots of sayings like a dime a dozen, is a thing that has a very specific meaning in English. It's a phrase that sort of means, something's cheap or not really unique. You can just get it anywhere. And that it's very contextual. It's very culturally relative. You couldn't just say that in French, literally, and have it mean the same thing that you want it to mean in English. And so what's really interesting is that actually the same thing can kind of happen in oral tradition. There are a lot of sort of, I think I'd like to call them speech gestures that take place and that are very culturally relative. So a really good example that linguists call creaky voice is sort of, some people, it's when you croak a little. Everyone can do it. Some people refer to it as like fry voice, like valley girl voice. I usually use it in my own dialect when I'm whining. So if I whine for you now, oh, my research is the worst. I've been having so much trouble with it. You can see my voice gets really high and whiny, and it quivers. It sort of does this creak, and it actually is caused by your vocal cords kind of pushing out air in quick succession. But that voice doesn't mean the same thing in every language. Just like when you use intonation to ask a question, that going up at the end, that's not true in every language. Going up doesn't mean you're curious, doesn't mean you're asking a question in languages that aren't English. I mean, it can. There are some languages in which it does, but not all of them. And so what's super hard about a written text is that it doesn't have things like creaky voice. There are efforts made. There's like exclamation points, commas for pauses, question marks for for that interrogative tone I was just talking about. But it's not the same, and we don't I don't really know what Navajo sounds like very well. I mean, I know what it sounds like. I've heard Navajo, but I don't know what sort of speech gestures are being used to connote meaning. My background is in slam poetry. A big part of why I'm doing this project is because I'm a slam poet, because I'm a spoken word artist, because I'm really interested in other forms of oral literature, other kinds of performed literature. Now, slam poetry isn't exactly an oral tradition. It doesn't come out of a long history of telling the same story over and over again. Individual artists write their own work and then they perform them. But what's interesting is that the art form actually has its own, to use the term again, speech gestures, its own sort of methods for, creating meaning. And those speech gestures aren't necessarily understood very easily by an audience, unless that audience has had a lot of experience with slam poetry. Slam poetry becomes more fun the more and more you get into it because you stop thinking of it as weird. Think about if you're watching baseball, which I don't really do, which is horrible because I'm from Boston. Red Sox is, the religion there. But, you go up and the batter comes up and, I don't know anything about baseball. But the point is, maybe you know their record because you're familiar with baseball. You know that this particular batter match with this particular pitcher is going to be really interesting and you're excited because you know the rules and you know the statistics and you know enough to get excited about that. And that's not something that anyone could just come in and watch. And I like to think of it as there are rules to slam poetry, there are rules to oral tradition that are very, very contextual, very sort of culturally specific. So I'm going to try to give you an example. Unfortunately, I don't really want to plagiarize, so I'm going to have to be embarrassing and do some of my poetry. So I'm going to do the beginning. I'm going to perform a little bit at the beginning of a poem I have called Dear Friend. And then I'm going to talk about the things I do with my voice to show you how a lot of that stuff it's not what you think it is. So here we go. I got my period in the 6th grade. And you told me you were proud of me, whispered over chicken nuggets and the white cafeteria lunch table. I told you you weren't my mother. And when, after only 4 more glorious cycles of my newfound womanhood, it went missing in action for 7 months, you told everyone I was pregnant. So, one thing you might think about that poem is that it's super emotional. You might even think oh, that's so weird. She tells a joke in the beginning, that's a joke, and she's so emotional about it. She's so intense, that sounded so intense. And one thing that's really interesting is a lot of the speech gestures that I'm using that are very common to sort of a lot of slam poetry. Not all artists do the same ones, but there's definitely a style that gets adapted. A good example is sort of, it's not creaky voice, it's kind of similar, but a kind of a quivering of your voice, of getting really, really intense, and really, it kind of can sound desperate, but it's not desperate. It's just emphasis. So when I say, I got my period, and I period, that's, oh my gosh, that's a ridiculous word to, all right, great. Anyway, you freeze on it like that, and you sort of emphasize it. Also, my voice goes up, you'll notice, for sort of no reason at all. That just, it means emphasis in the slam poetry community. It's sort of you tip it off to listen. A lot of other things that I'll do with my voice are really just to keep it in a rhythm. If I were to just say those words not like a slam poet, it's actually hard for me because I'm so used to performing them, but I can try to give you a sense of what it would be like. I said, I got my period in the 6th grade, and you told me you were proud of me. Whispered over chicken nuggets and the white cafeteria lunch table. I told you you weren't my mother. So that has a lot less rhythm. I think it's a lot less interesting to listen to, but I'm also, really into slam poetry and really into that particular aesthetic for performing oral literature. So, let's think again about sort of that rhythm thing. What I do with my voice when I say, I told you you weren't my mother. So, you told me you were proud of me. Whispered over chicken nuggets and the white cafeteria lunch table. I told you you weren't my mother. So there's this big pause between I told you and I go up. It's I like to call this particular technique climbing a hill and then getting a breath of air. And actually a lot of the time you'll see it. It comes after a really intense part where they might genuinely be trying to get a breath of air. And that can either be done to create the sense of intensity that they are putting their whole heart into it, or it's because they actually need that breath of air, which is really interesting. So you see, you can see how that style would have developed very organically. It would come from people genuinely needing a way to insert rhythm when they need to take a breath. That's basically those are the only examples I have right now that I'm thinking about, but I think there are so many others that I don't even know because I'm so familiar with that aesthetic, with that style of talking. It's just so second nature to me. My friends make fun of me that I can read food labels in the slam poetry diction, and I can. Fun fact. And to bring it back a little bit, to sort of rein it in, the reason I'm doing this exercise, the reason I'm sort of explaining very carefully speech gestures that an audience who doesn't listen to a lot of slam poetry might not understand, is because obviously a white audience wouldn't know the equivalents that would happen in a Navajo oral tradition, and you couldn't capture them from writing, which I talked about earlier. There is no notation for any of what I was talking about. There's no notation for that breath. There's no notation for that quivering and that intensity and that building up and then crashing down. Like, there isn't that. Of course, there isn't any for Navajo oral tradition. That's something that we don't, we don't have a very good record of. And so when we translate a Navajo oral tradition, not only are we probably running into difficulties with the content, Navajo to English, that's a big jump. We're making a huge jump from oral to text. And I think that I feel like that's the best way that I know how to explain it. That's like my familiarity with that difficulty. When I read a slam poet's work written down, it's not as exciting to me. It doesn't have those same things that I'm familiar with. It's not as fun because I don't see those rules that I was talking about happening. I don't, get to participate like that. And there are some Navajo who don't want their oral tradition translated into a text because of many reasons. I'm sure there are many reasons that translation is problematic, but I bet one of them is this what I'm talking about, this sort of disparity between being able to feel like you know all the rules and like you're a part of a community and that context is very specific and you're special for understanding it, how I feel when I watch a spoken word performance. That might be how Navajo people feel when they watch, their creation story or, sacred like songs. They don't necessarily want that to lose that contextual, cultural specificity when it when it becomes a text. That's basically all I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about how I've noticed that and how I've come across it in slam poetry and my way of connecting to the material I'm researching, even though I'm not Navajo. I might make another video before the summer's over. I probably won't. But if I do, maybe I'll see you then, you internet audience. Thank you for listening, if you did. Bye.